Welcome to Chapter 6, Stress and Well-Being at Work. I'm sure a lot of you can relate to working in a stressful environment, especially when you're students. There's lots of stress with academics as well. So we're going to talk today about a couple of the theories behind stress, why you're stressed, how you can prevent it, and maybe even the organization you work in is causing stress, and they can do some things to help you manage it. So, in terms of learning outcomes, we're going to define stress, what a stressor is, and de-stress, the 4 approaches to stress, the psychophysiology of stress response, work and non-work causes of stress, the JDCS and ERI models. Man, oh man, they love models in organizational behavior. Here's another couple we're going to go through and how those models link to the negative consequences of stress. The consequences of stress in general, individual factors that influence a person's response to stress and strain, and the stages finally of preventive stress management. How do we prevent stress in our lives and our workplace? Let's jump on in. Okay, so stress has many definitions, and it's often comes with negative connotations. It can also be a positive thing, right? Like a stressor, or in other words, a demand, is just an event in a person's life, right? And stress is really the unconscious preparation for fight or flight. Like your body starts to maybe have a faster heartbeat, your pupils maybe dilate, your breathing rate goes up because you're ready to essentially fight whatever the stressor is or run, flight, right? And this is a biological response that has been wired in human beings for hundreds of thousands of years. And probably out there in the wild when we're walking through Africa and hunting animals and gathering berries, this type of response would come up once in a while, right? You weren't always in a life or death situation. Quite often you were living peacefully in your community or village. But in the current workforce, this could happen, weekly or daily or whatever else. So a stressor is simply the person or even an event triggers the stress response. And that leads to distress or strain. And that refers to adverse, so negative psychological, physical behavior and organizational consequences that may occur because of the stressful event. And like I said, now that we are in a modern society, this kind of primitive response comes up again and again in our workforce or our workplace. In fact, almost 60% of Canadians report being stressed in their workplace. So that's a pretty high level. And I would go as far as saying that there's a lot of evidence, at least long-term evidence from the World Health Organization, that long-term stress, so stress that continues to go on a weekly and monthly and yearly basis for some people, has very detrimental effects, health effects. It can impact your cardiovascular system, it can impact your mental health, it can impact your emotional health. And so the big change is this whole fight or flight response that used to be something that happened instantaneously and probably passed within a few minutes is now a prolonged state. And these prolonged states can have a very negative impact on people and can be very tough. Okay, so there's 4 approaches to defining stress. And the first one is homeostatic or medical. And this is when external events or demands cause this emergency response or this fight or flight reaction. And what happens is it throws off your equilibrium. So homeostasis is when the body is in equilibrium. And when there's an external stress, this is what I was talking about previously, the heart rate goes up, the pupils might dilate, the breathing, all of those things is your physical response, your fight or flight response to a stress. The next approach to defining is a cognitive level, the cognitive appraisal, and that is really the psychological stress of something. So not necessarily how it makes you feel physically by your heart beating faster or your breathing increasing. It's defined as how you're dealing with it mentally, and there's two types of responses on a cognitive level. And the first one is problem-focused coping. So problem-focused coping and emotional-focused coping are the two ways that people deal with it. Problem-focused coping emphasizes managing the external stressor in the situation, right? Like if your boss is always yelling at you and that's the external situation, maybe the way you control it is by quitting or not spending as much time around your boss. And then the emotional focused coping, it emphasizes how you manage that stress personally. So a boss starts yelling at you, what strategies do you use to manage that stress and maybe de-escalate your response? The next approach is person or environmental fit. And this is when there is a conflict between either the expectations of a job or maybe your abilities or how well you fit into an organization or a position. And so the response is primarily psychological and emotional strain. And this is when you're simply in a job that is too demanding or it doesn't really get you excited every day. And if you stay in that role for a long period of time, this stress and strain can manifest itself in depression. Like this is why people, at least one reason might be why people are clinically depressed, right? They just are in a position or a job or an organization that they're not excited about and that stresses them out. The next approach is the psychoanalytical approach, and that is when there's a discrepancy between your ego ideal and your self-image and essentially what's happening. And that is called psychological strain. And so what's really interesting about this is we all have an ideal, right, of who we are and what we're about, and we have a self-image. And sometimes in life, stress results from this discrepancy between who we want to be, ideally, right, what our self-image is, and the environment we're in. There's a disconnect between who we want to be, the job or role we want to be in, and what is happening, right? Freud came up with this. It is a psychoanalytical theory that is far more detailed than my brief overview, but what you have to know for the purpose of this course is that this psychoanalytical approach is simply there's a discrepancy between your ideal ego self or your self-image and what is occurring, right? The difference between your image in your head and reality, which, listen, a lot of people at some point when they struggle in various aspects of their life, there's a conflict between their self-esteem, their ego, and what actually is happening. Okay, so what is the response of stress? So at the very first level, the stress begins by releasing chemical messengers in your body, primarily adrenaline, into the bloodstream. And these messages or messengers activate the sympathetic nervous system or the adrenal glands, like the hormonal system. And the hormones and the sympathetic nervous system are the two systems that work together to trigger this fight or flight response, right? So you get this stressor, the chemicals are released. After the chemicals are released, you go into fight or flight. So blood flow is redirected to your extremities where you want to run your heart, your lungs. You all of a sudden become more aware. Glycogen or sugar is released into your body, and then your immune system is suppressed because what the government, or sorry, what the body says is that I don't need the immune system right now because I'm being attacked by a lion. And being attacked by a lion is far more important than dealing with maybe the flu. So this is why people who are under stress for a long period of time may be more prone to being sick because their immune system is always being suppressed because they're always in panic mode. And then there's a physiological shift, offensive posturing. So the body responds and shifts from a neutral posture. Maybe you're sitting down, you're relaxed, to an offensive posture, meaning you're ready to go, you're ready to run, you're ready to get out of there or fight, right? Fight whatever is the stressor. And again, like I said, these are very ancient biological responses that are being triggered by modern stressors in our work environments and the organizations we spend time with, as well as our personal life. If it is prolonged, we've talked about this, it'll lead to a lot of issues down the line for sure. Okay, so I alluded to this really briefly. There are two major sources of stress. Like, not only do we have a lot of stresses at work and a lot of demands at work or even school, we also have non-work demands outside of it. So work stress is caused by factors within the work environment. Maybe they're task demands, maybe they're demands of the role, maybe there's interpersonal demands, like you're not getting along with your boss or colleagues. Maybe the role that you have is not very clear, it's ambiguous, meaning they aren't really giving you many clear indicators of what type of work needs to be done. The interpersonal demands are the demands, of interacting with others. And maybe you work with people who are not too pleasant, who kind of stress you out. And then there's physical demands. There's some jobs in which you have to stand on your feet for 8 hours, in which you have to lift heavy things. There's a lot in the news right now about how hard it is to work at Amazon. They talk about working on Amazon in the fulfillment warehouses, how much walking they have to do, and they're on their feet a long time, and they have to get the stuff really, really quickly. So that type of job is very physically demanding. So there's all these things that can cause work stress and demands. But in addition, a lot of people will have to go home and deal with stressors at home, right? Maybe the conflict is that you're spending too many hours at work and not enough time at home, and that is demand. We have dealing with children. We have maybe dealing with helping your elderly parents. There's a lot of things outside of work that also cause stress because it's very demanding. Even when you get home after work or school or on the weekend, it doesn't seem to stop after that. Okay, so there's two models linking stress to negative consequences. And the first one is the JDCS, which stands for Job Demand Control Support. And it asserts that high demands at work and low control and low support cause strain and stress. And so you can imagine if you work at a very demanding job in which you have very little control over the amount of work, how you deal with things, or have any say, how that is stressful. And then in addition, if you have low support, meaning that you don't have a lot of resources or people around you to help you, you can see how that might cause stress. And research shows that high demands combined with low control increases both physical and mental health risks, right? You can see that if you're in an environment all the time that has high demands and you have little control, little support, how over time that's going to cause a lot of stress. And then the second model we're going to look at is effort reward imbalance, the ERI model. And just by the name, you can kind of think about what this model is about. And this is if a person exerts a high effort, a high degree of work, really busts their butt, but there's little return. There's little reward. You know, you spend 60 hours a week working very physically demanding, in a physically demanding job, and the salary is very low, right? You get a very low return. Maybe it's not very satisfying. People aren't saying thank you. You don't feel appreciated or recognized or feel like you're accomplishing anything. That's an example of a work environment, an organization in which you're exerting a high degree of effort and there's a low return in terms of reward. And so both the ERI and the JDC models are not mutually exclusive. They kind of complement each other, right? You can see how, although they're related, they may be complete, like you could be in a high demanding job with low control and low support and putting in lots of effort and have a low return. So you could be in a job in which both of these models apply to the work environment, or maybe just the JDC model or the ERI model apply, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. They definitely could apply to the same type of work environment. Okay, negative consequences of stress. Well, here's a chart. It goes through all of the different stressors and how unhealthy they are. So you can see you have heart problems, back problems, 2 to 3 times more injuries, infections, you're getting sick, you have mental health problems. So we know that through the research that a stressful environment with not a lot of support will lead to all of these negative aspects. And so there's 2 paths. There's the direct pathway, and that's when employees lack sufficient influence over hazardous conditions in the workplace. They lack control over necessary things to avoid threats to their both mental and physical stress. And then there's the indirect pathway, and that certain stressors in a workplace, especially high pressure, low control workplaces that we talked about previously, can contribute to accidents and injuries. And now we're talking about being physically hurt at work, right? Like if you don't sleep well, if you have to medicate yourself, people drink excessively, they feel depressed, they don't want to go to work in the morning. All of those things are indirect conflicts or indirect consequences, I should say, of stress. So you have both the direct pathway, so those are things like getting hurt on the job, and then the indirect is finding all sorts of ways to cope with stress that may not be very positive, right? But there are positive ways. The good news is there's positive ways, right, to deal with stress. So those stress most commonly is talked about in negative terminology. And most of this lecture so far, we've talked about all the negative things that stress can cause. Long-term health problems, mental health problems, physical issues, emotional. There's also positive. There's also a positive outcomes when it comes to stress, because let's face it, if there was no stress in your life and you weren't being pushed to do anything, you wouldn't accomplish much, right? So they call the positive stress eustress, and essentially what it does is it might bring your performance up. It might cause you to maybe work a little bit harder or assert more energy or thought into a task, because it allows you to perform well. Like the best athletes or music performers or actors are in very stressful environments. And sometimes they show up and they do a fantastic job. But you have to have an environment that is positive, that has support, in which you have control. All those things that we talked about in previous slides about what causes the negative consequences. If you have those things in place, typically you're going to perform well. For example, you have exams and tests at school. That's a lot of pressure for some people. But having said that, there's a lot of support too. If you are struggling academically, there's counselors, there's peer tutors, there's all sorts of online resources. You have support, right? Um, the Yerkens-Dawson law is what this diagram illustrates. And it illustrates that stress is positive to a certain point, right? When you reach the optimal performance. But beyond that optimal point, additional stress starts to become negative, right? Starts to be detrimental to your performance. So know that a little bit of stress is good. A little bit of stress gets you out of bed, it gets you working hard, it gets you motivated. But if it's too stressful, that begins to hurt your performance, right? Eustress is typically a characteristic of being healthy. Once you're in de-stress, then it's no longer healthy. Okay, a lot of dealing with stress is how you approach it and what your personality is like. So certain personalities deal well with stress, and other ones do not. So you can see with this diagram here, high strain due to stress, type A personalities, having a negative outlook, those types of personalities often struggle with stress. The combination of those things, sometimes being type A, you're trying to be a perfectionist, and if you screw up on a test or you don't do well, or maybe you show up to work a little late, you're extra hard on yourself, and that causes stress that maybe you shouldn't be as stressed as you are based on the situation. Um, so, I mean, the other thing is like this type A personality, they found that people that are so tightly wound end up having heart problems and stress problems later on anyway. So it's so important for us to relax and to really, maybe be a bit easier on ourselves. On the other hand, type B personalities or type B behaviors um, are people who are a little less urgent. They're not as worried about getting ahead. They're not as worried about your social status. They might be a little bit less aggressive and hostile. And this type of personality does very well in a stressful situation and deals with stress better, right? Some other characteristics is if you have a high degree of hardiness, like you can deal with, adversity. You have a high self-esteem. You feel like no matter what happens with the test or at work, you still think that you deserve to be loved and that you still have worth. Self-efficacy, meaning that you believe that you can meet the demands of the job or school or whatever you're being asked. And then self-reliance, that you feel like you can rely on yourself to get done what you need to get done. Okay, stages of stress prevention. So there are three stages. There's the primary stage, there's a secondary stage, and then there's the tertiary stage. In the primary stage of stress prevention, it aims to reduce and modify or eliminate the demand or stressor. So in that stage, you're focusing on the stressor itself, right? The bad boss, the unfavorable work environment, whatever it is. The secondary stage of prevention is intended to alter and modify your response to it, right? The difference between being a type A or a type B person, the difference between having a low self-esteem and a high self-esteem. So the secondary stage is how the individual responds to the demand. And the tertiary stage is how do you create prevention, right? How do you maybe heal from the individual stresses that have caused you to worry in the past, and then how do you develop the personality, skills, and ability to deal with stress in the future. Okay, individual stress prevention. If you punch into Google, how do I reduce my stress? You're going to get a million answers because it is a very broad problem and a widespread problem. And there's a lot of opinions out there. But here are 5 techniques that I know will help you for sure. The first one is positive thinking. Mindset is a huge piece, right? Stay around optimistic people. Try to be optimistic. Try to be positive. Just having a positive mindset will really, really help. And you can see these are all kind of cogs in a wheel of a machine. That positive thinking is a huge piece here. Time management is another one. Being able to schedule your time and manage your time. Making sure that you have leisure activities and you relax at some time, have some hobbies, get out there and exercise, be physical, move every day, eat good food, and make sure that you are paying attention to your nutrition. And then the last one is maybe opening up and talking to other people about the stress. And in some cases, maybe a professional, right? Maybe you get to the point where it is beginning to damage your performance at work or school and affect your relationships. And maybe at that point, you can consider some professional help. There's lots of opportunities here at Georgian to meet with people and talk to counselors confidentially. If you're feeling overwhelmed or you're feeling stressed, I would encourage you to reach out and talk to someone professionally, because the earlier you can develop the skill set to deal with stress, the better. It'll certainly lead to a more, I don't want to say stress-free life, but a life in which it's easier to cope with stress. Okay, so that was a very quick overview of stress and stress management. Not a ton of content here in this chapter, just a couple of theories and definitions, and the 8 learning outcomes here that we went through at the beginning. Hopefully you found that information useful. As always, if you have any questions, please just reach out.